What's going on with Apple Log?
Wait, this dynamic range doesn't seem that great right now. What's going on?
I have the answer for why that is, and it is not third party's fault. I have a hot take. I'm 100% sure Apple doesn't want you shooting manually, even in Apple Log. Now, why do I think this? Well, let's look at this impossible image. Okay, it's not the most interesting image, but it is impossible. I have set my exposure automatically and then adjusted just ever so slightly with a variable ND so that everything was held within the image. My highlights do not clip until 96%. Why is it impossible? This gets into our first term, highlight clip point. That is the moment where you can no longer resolve any information and your sensor is too overwhelmed by the amount of photons hitting it that it just goes white. It goes from professional looking to amateur looking. Most manufacturers provide a range of ISO information. In fact, most manufacturers let you know what the native ISO is, Apple, so that you can shoot manually. Apple didn't exactly do this. They did provide a highlight clip point for the ultra wide lens at the lowest possible ISO. And that's kind of that's it. But with just a little bit of legwork, we can figure out what the manual clip point is for each ISO. And we know that ISO 200 has a clip point of 80% IRE. This is the law of the log. And this is what highlight clip points are meant to provide in terms of information. And Indy is going to go get some squirrel. Apple, for some reason, allows automatic to ignore these clip points.
Okay, so let's just auto tap that. So that's holding all of those highlights. So that's auto tapped, auto exposure, right on to middle gray. Still holding the highlights. Okay, now let's go ahead and lock it. And now they're all gone?
The iPhone camera has something called extended dynamic range, which merges two images for each frame to extend the dynamic range of the camera. Where this happens depends on your shutter speed. That means Apple is using an HDR process even within Apple Log. Now, this is not HDR like your TV. This is HDR like photography, where you merge multiple exposures within the same frame. This is why this is an impossible image, because it's actually two images merged together. So when I hit lock, it moves from EDR to a single exposure of Apple Log.
If you are shooting manually in Apple Log, you may feel like there is a reduction in dynamic range.
One of the biggest problems for me is I always want a little bit more control over what the camera is doing, and then I'm like, oh, I'll use one of the apps. Just maybe I'm like super paranoid somehow. Maybe I'm mistaken. Hey, this dynamic range doesn't seem that great right now. What's going on? And then I go to the native camera app, and then it switches on like the super HDR, and you're just getting everything. You're like, wait, what?
Technically, there isn't one, because you are simply exposing to what the Apple Log can actually expose to. So if you're at ISO 55 and your highlights clip, that's because it actually clipped. If you shoot automatically, you get 5 to 6 stops of information above middle gray. But without EDR, you can only do 3.5 stops of information at ISO 200. This also answers two lingering questions as to why Apple has never provided a native ISO or highlight clip points. And now it makes complete sense. Because if you're using a merged image, an HDR image, then what is a clip point? What is a native ISO? If you're pulling highlight information from ISO 1600 and using the cleaner shadow detail of ISO 100, what does that equal out to? What ISO is that? So this is amazing. It is actually incredibly impressive that the iPhone can compute this much information and encode it out into Apple ProRes 422 HQ. Well, now, what are the cons? In terms of pure image quality, none. Really, I have noticed no issue between using manual or shooting with this automatic EDR. Really is only upside in terms of image quality and dynamic range. The con is in capturing it. Because you have to give up control. You cannot use it in a fully manual setting. And it will only work if you are using a extremely automatic mode. If you even try to shift your focus manually prior to filming, it's going away. If you are in a scenario where you can control your lighting, make sure to go a fully manual workflow from the start. That way, there's no possibility that you're going to set your exposure thinking that you have the highlights. Now, EDR will turn off if it doesn't need to be on. So if you don't have highlights that exceed the dynamic range of Apple log, so if you're ISO 200 and you have no highlights that exceed 80% IRE, EDR doesn't click on. Like I said earlier, EDR is a shutter speed dependent process. So if your shutter speed exceeds 300 degrees, it will turn off. This is all about retaining highlights. And if you have slowed your shutter speed to that amount, you are definitely shooting in low light and won't be able to merge those images seamlessly. Unlike local tone mapping of previous generations, this is not going to adjust your exposure. It's only going to try and get more highlight information, which is actually a pretty cool thing. So why does Apple want you to shoot automatically? Because that way they can use extended dynamic range and merge two exposures into one, giving you impossible levels of dynamic range for this small sensor. It's going to be so interesting to see if 28 years later implements using extended dynamic range for their exterior scenes, or if they use the limited dynamic range of shooting manual. What was their exposure strategies? It's gonna be so fascinating to find out. Now, I posted a video just a few days ago talking about this where I thought what Apple was doing was clamping the signal, because it really looked like a clamp was just simply added. It looked like a duck, it talked like a duck, but apparently it was just two ducks standing on top of each other, which is very surprising to me because Apple has posted about this nowhere. As far as I know, this is not published anywhere publicly, a detailed breakdown as to what was happening. So I viewed all of this as a negative until today. I'm gonna have to talk to my therapist about my outlook on life, but actually, what I thought was a glass half empty issue turns out to be a very cool and helpful feature that we should have known about, and I'm so glad that we do now. Because EDR in so many ways might be able to save your butt in high contrast areas that your cell phone simply cannot expose without this composite image. So, touche Apple. I thought you were doing something insane. Turns out you're doing something insanely cool. Thank you so much. Please like, please subscribe. Send this to any iPhone user because this is incredibly important information to have in your back pocket.